There's no shortage of books about how you can improve your writing, but not many of them come from contemporary scholars of rhetorical style. So let me tell you a little bit about this one. The world really does seem to be overflowing with books about writing and style and grammar, but many of them just aren't really worth your time. They're mired in counterproductive, overly prescriptivist approaches to writing. That is, many writers who write about style are stuck on old ideas about what is and isn't correct. You know, the kinds of rules you learned in high school that it turns out are mostly only rules because some popular goofball in the 1700s decided that they should be. And that's in contrast to thinking about style as a set of tools or options that you have at your disposal. The first kind of book will help you to appease a surly editor. The second kind, though, will make you a more deliberate writer, one who is in control of the decisions you make with your sentences and the effects those choices will have on your readers. This second kind of book is harder to come by, though, so it's worth pointing out the good ones when they come along. Actually, this book has some personal significance to me, because Butler's scholarship on style was really influential on me as my own academic identity was starting to take shape. One of Butler's essays, Style and the Public Intellectual: Rethinking Composition in the Public Sphere, was one of the motivators for me to do my doctoral research on the style of science communicators, and of course, to start sharing the knowledge of my discipline on this show. But anyway, when I heard that Butler was putting out a practical guide about writing style, I snapped it right up. So let's get right into talking about how the book works, what I like about it, and what I'm not as crazy about. And then, of course, it will be up to you to decide whether it has a role to play in your writing life. From the start, the writer's style is unabashedly rhetorical. In the preface, Butler acknowledges that the book is rooted in research important to stylistic study, and that it's designed to help guide writers who wish to incorporate style in their writing. He then goes on to say, it provides synthesis of stylistic concepts and practices. It analyzes how writers use style and examines the effects of their stylistic and rhetorical decisions on meaning. It is a rhetorical guide in that it considers the writer's purpose, the context or occasion in which they are writing, and their audience. So the goal here is to create a guide to help writers make more deliberate and meaningful use of their style in order to address the situations they find themselves in more effectively, all with a foundation not in traditional grammar rules, but in the most important research on writing and style. And the table of contents reflects the overall vision for the book. We begin with chapters that introduce and define the basic idea of style, what it is and what it means in practice. We move on to chapters about why style matters and how it affects the way messages are communicated and understood. With that theoretical foundation in place, we move on to more practice-oriented chapters that work through rhetorical ways of thinking about style on the level of the sentence and the level of the essay, with techniques like imitation and the sentence-building tools of generative rhetoric. Then we get chapters that talk about traditional virtues of style, correctness, clarity, cohesion, emphasis, and so on, before concluding with a chapter of exercises/essay prompts for practicing and thinking through your own approach to style. Along the way, each chapter is also supported with a diverse range of examples and excerpts from other writers' use of stylistic techniques, and additional sections that give you a chance to see a concept from a different angle, to practice an idea through analysis or writing, or to evaluate and reflect on possible applications of the ideas each chapter presents. Of course, it's worth pointing out that this book is clearly designed as a textbook. It has the classroom in mind more than the at-home rhetorical enthusiast, but we'll talk more about the implications of that a little bit later. Overall, though, Butler says that the book makes the argument that style makes writing memorable, keeping some texts alive for decades or centuries, and that the book's goal is to be not prescriptive but generative. The text introduces readers and writers to an array of innovative stylistic resources. It offers unique ways to think about style and to develop knowledge of the stylistic techniques available in writing for different audiences, rhetorical situations, and practical, academic, or artistic purposes. So, knowing that I'm a rhetorician, it shouldn't surprise you that I'm a huge fan of this book's commitment to presenting style through ancient and modern rhetorical perspectives. Throughout, you'll see quotes and references to the big names of ancient rhetoric, your Aristotles, Ciceros, and Quintilians, and you'll see references to significant work on style since the 20th century. The Richards, Lanham and Oman, Francis Christensen, Peter Elbow, Jeannie Fonestock, Carolyn Miller, and of course, friend of the show, Kenneth Burke. If you wanted a condensed, comprehensive overview of where the subdiscipline of rhetorical style is at now, it would be hard to beat this book's presentation of the who's who and what's what. From the time you start to the time you'll finish, you'll have been well acquainted with the most useful takeaways from the current state of research on writing and style. And of course, this is a book for learners, not a scholarly treatise on style. But I really appreciate the way this text lets readers know where these ideas are coming from, and that they're coming from somewhere. I also like that this approach to style isn't just the one-off declaration of a modern Robert Loth, but that it's a reflection of a long and wide-ranging history of rhetorical scholarship. In other words, it's not a book about how to develop style according to Paul Butler. It's a book about how to develop your style according to the disciplines of rhetoric and composition, which not only gives the book an authority a lot of popular, more idiosyncratic books lack, but also gives you a chance to follow up on things you might find interesting. Oh, you want to know more about Christensen's generative rhetoric? Well, you can, because Butler tells you where that idea came from. Consequently, I also really appreciate the book's general approach to style. It's not a list of rules or a catalog of devices. As rhetoric is so often concerned with the practical implications of the ways in which we communicate, this rhetorical field guide encourages us to think about style in context and to think about style with a purpose. So it talks about possibilities and options that you have when writing, using language like anaphora, liturgies, and oxymoron, which will be familiar to those of you who are keeping up with the press releases from the Quintilian Institute, but it always talks about them in the context of doing something. So it's not like, here's an example of anaphora, but here's an example of anaphora in Joan Didion's essay, Goodbye to All That, and how that anaphora works to control pacing and to reinforce an emotional tone. It's an approach that will not just help you learn the different ways that you can play with the structure of sentences and the meanings of words, but it will also show you why you might want to and how stylistic choices can influence the quality of your message. That means, in other words, that you're learning about style as a purpose-driven communication tool rather than just as a decorative exercise in making your sentences fancier. And of course, for similar reasons, I really appreciate the selection of prompts and exercises built into each chapter. They do the important job of encouraging you to think about the approach to style more deeply and to apply it. And that's where the real learning happens, in the doing. So again, it's not a book that's just going to tell you about style or rehearse the research for you. It's a book that's designed to help you learn, practice, and internalize a deeply rhetorical approach to developing your own style as a writer. Now, it's not all an unmitigated triumph. I mean, what is? I do have some reservations about this book, but there are also reservations about things I like. Really, I guess this is a section of further praise, but praise with asterisks. And the first is that, though it isn't very long, it is pretty dense. And I don't mean that the prose is obscure or hard to read. Butler's writing is, though definitely academic, reasonably accessible and engaging. No, when I say dense, I mean it packs a lot of information into a small space. You'll hardly get through a paragraph without an example from an acclaimed writer or a citation from an important scholar's work. And that's great because it all contributes to the authority and utility of the book, but it can feel like a lot sometimes. There were moments where I felt a tad pummeled by all the citations that were coming my way as I was reading through it, and I might have appreciated, for example, a more straightforward and conversational discussion of major principles, maybe with footnotes for further reading. I think what I'm really getting at, actually, is that because the book is so dense with citations and examples and exercises, it feels a little bit like it builds its effect through collage rather than linear discussion or explanation. And I'm kind of into that, but I can imagine it creating difficulties for readers who are expecting something a little lighter on the palate. If you're in the mood to really immerse yourself in the book and in all it has to offer, its density isn't really an issue, but you may run into trouble if you're thinking of just skimming through it. And while I just got done saying that I love this book's thoroughly rhetorical approach to style, I also want to put an asterisk on that love. See, I've sold my soul to rhetoric, so of course I love rhetoric, but I also kind of hate it, or rather, I know it well enough to know what I wish that rhetoric did better. So let me be clear in saying that I think the traditional rhetorical approach to talking about style as a practice is really useful and important. Putting style in context for a purpose is the best way to think about it if you really want to improve your writing in meaningful ways. But I think the traditional rhetorical approach to talking about stylistic techniques is somewhat limited. Don't get me wrong, I love the old terms for tropes and figures. I think they're a lot of fun just by themselves, but I think there's also value in learning that certain patterns like epistrophe and polysyndeton and zeugma have names. Learning these traditional terms can help you to be more deliberate in using stylistic techniques because they give you an explicit knowledge of what's possible and a vocabulary for thinking and talking about the choices you're making. That said, and this may just be my early background in linguistics talking, if we're talking about style, we're talking about language. And if we're talking about language, the best tool for doing that, I'd argue, is the vocabulary of modern linguistics. So while there is utility in knowing what epizeuxis is, I think it's more useful to have, or at least to begin with, a good knowledge of subjects, verbs, modifiers, and clauses. And it's not that the more fundamental engagement with the language is absent from the writer's style, but I did find myself craving more grounding in the syntax of language as I was reading through all the talk of schemes and tropes. In other words, I think a good handle on English syntax is an important, if not necessary, first step towards developing a deep understanding of style. And that kind of syntactical talk isn't really present here in the same way as, for example, it was in Nora Bacon's The Well-Crafted Sentence, which we've talked about before. And that may not be an oversight or a shortcoming with the book so much as it is a consequence of my third reservation about it, which is its intended audience. See, the reason the things I don't like about this book are also things that I like about the book is that I really like this book in the context of teaching a college class about writing. If I were to pin down an intended audience for this text, just based on the way it talks about style and grounds everything in the work of style scholars, I would think that it's really intended to be used in a class about style specifically for probably third or fourth year college students. Like I mentioned before, this book is not only thoroughly rhetorical, but also fundamentally academic. Chapter 11, which contains exercises for applying stylistic concepts, calls those exercises assignments. And they all involve writing essays that I can easily see students writing in a class, but that I don't really see most at-home writers doing, or maybe this is just me. In other words, if you're in the second half of your English major with an emphasis in rhetoric and writing, the density of this book is not an issue, it's kind of the point, and the lack of more fundamental discussions of grammar is less an issue if we're assuming that you've already taken a required grammar class and have a good handle on English syntax. If you don't quite have the appetite for a more fully academic discussion of style, this may not be the book for you. But let's also be honest, if you've been watching the show for a while, you're at least as good as any rhetoric major out there, so it's more a question of your taste than of your capability. So in the end, I'd happily recommend Paul Butler's The Writer's Style. It's a book written by a prominent style scholar, and it's deeply informed by the research. You could go out there and read the last 30 to 40 years of scholarship, but if you're looking for a comprehensive and concise snapshot of where style studies are now, and one that guides you in applying that knowledge in practical, purposeful ways, you'd have a hard time doing better than this book. A lot of books on writing end up being idiosyncratic products of one person, usually someone who fancies themselves a successful writer by some measure. And while there is value in learning how one great writer approaches writing, the real value in the writer's style is in the way it represents an entire discipline's approach to writing. It's not just one person's thoughts. It's one person's effort to put a whole body of research into the hands of writers in a concise and practical way. And it's largely successful at it. For a more general audience, of course, I think it could handle its approach a little differently, but that would be me asking it to do something that it's not trying to do. I do have some reservations, but I have at least some reservations about everything. Rest assured, I'd never recommend something where my reservations outweighed my endorsements. At any rate, if you're looking for a useful guide to style and you're up for a little academic prose, this one's a keeper. But with that, thanks for watching. It's always great to hear from you in the comments, and I suppose I should also thank Dr. Butler for the influence his work has had on my own. There's a chance we'd all still be here if I hadn't encountered his work early on, but it would have been a much slimmer chance. So, lucky for all of us, we're all here together, and I can't wait to see you again in the next one.